Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for coming. Today we have the pleasure and an honor really to receive Rokhaya Diallo, Rokhaya or Rokhaya, depends on the country, the pronunciation, and so on. In France, people call her Rokhaya Diallo. I must say Rokhaya is actually the most prominent, certainly the most famous, in my view, the most influential and important anti-racist activist in France, but I would say most important activist in France in general and beyond, because Rokhaya is a journalist, she's a filmmaker as well, but she also writes for The Guardian, for The Washington Post, and you actually also have a fellowship at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where you actually teach as well, right? And you're actually there because you're teaching this semester. And so the format of this session will be, as we told our colleague on the emails, a conversational lecture, difficult to say, which means basically that I'm going to ask Rokhaya a few questions. I'd like to start, very briefly by asking you something that I realized that I never knew. I should actually maybe tell people how we met. So Rokhaya actually has also, as part of your bio, I forgot, has a great podcast. So when I published my first book, she kindly invited me to her podcast, which you do with a colleague of yours, Grace Lee, right? So it's called Kif Taras. And also a very important podcast because it talks about race, has a very huge audience, but also, it's very important, invites intellectuals, sociologists, philosophers, writers from racialized communities, basically in the Francophone world. And quite, I mean, since then, many podcasts of that kind have been burgeoning, but it's a very important one. So we met in this context, and so there is something I don't know about you, is how did you become such an important activist?
Thank you so much. First of all, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Mohamed, for inviting me, and thanks to the French department for welcoming me. It's my first time here in Brown, so I'm glad to be here and to be able to speak about those French issues. So I, as a student and as a young person, I was really much involved in feminist groups. It was the moment when France was thinking about banning religious signs in schools, and I realized I was in a white feminist group when I noticed and understood that most of the people who were in the same group as me favored the law, and they were okay with the fact of excluding Muslim girls and women, but mostly girls, from schools. And that's, I think, the moment when my anti-racist thinking started. And also, it was the same time when two teenagers died being chased by the police in Clichy-sous-Bois in 2005. And from their deaths, so Ziad Bena and Bouna Traoré, 3 weeks of uprisings started in the suburbs of Paris, and then spread all over France. And the way it was covered by the media made me think that we needed to have different people speaking about those issues. So with those two moments, the rise of the Islamophobia and the police brutality being covered in a very racist way, I decided to found an organization, an anti-racist organization. It was in 2006-07. Which name was Les Indivisibles, so the indivisible, and it was named after the French Constitution. So the first article of the Constitution says that the French Republic is a social, democratic, laic, secular, and indivisible. And so we wanted to use that word to say that as French citizens or people living in France, we should be indivisible and not be divided by racism. So we decided to use humor to tackle racism, and especially like public statements, public discourse. And we created, that's what made me very visible in the media. We created like a parody, a ceremony, a satirical ceremony, which name was Les Yabon Award. And for French speakers, you may understand that it was referring to Yabon Banania. And the purpose of the ceremony was to reward the most racist sentences authored by public figures. So it was a way for us to expose systemic racism, and of course to make people understand that it was not like just one person being racist, but several people being racist in different spaces, and also to return the stigma and to just have power over people who are that we feel that they insult us on a daily basis. And the first ceremony was very well covered by the media. I was invited on several radio, TV shows, and then so in a show I was invited to in Canal Plus at that time. I was hired by the show after being interviewed there about the organizations and the ceremony. And that's how I started. To me, it was just something that would last one season. So I was hired by Canal Plus and then hired by RTL. And then so I started journalism. And at the same time, I was noticed by a publisher to write a first book. So I just decided to have a break from my job and maybe spend, because you make good money being on TV. So I was like, okay, I can make money. I have time to write, and I just will have a break for a season. And it's been 15 years. That's how it started.
So you said something about les indivisibles, or the indivisible, and which brings me to the theme of the conversation, which is anti-Black racism and Islamophobia. And I find it striking, and I'm sure surprising for many people who are in the room, that Islamophobia is something that is very central to your activism. So is, and it's another question, but it's connected, the notion that racialized people should act together, right? That is to say, in France, Maghrebi, people who come from the Maghreb or North Africa, and people who come from mostly, not only the Caribbean and West Africa. So can you tell us more about that, your experience of unifying, so to speak, anti-racist movements, gestures, and so on? Because this is a very rare sort of form of solidarity that you embody, in my view.
Yes, that's interesting, because I never thought about my activism in that way, but the purpose of Les Indivisibles, even with the name, was to unite many different people with many different backgrounds. And actually, in the very beginning, we included anti-Asian racism, because like with the organizations we made, we produced a little, a small, very short animated clips for YouTube. It was the beginning of YouTube at that time, and like one of the two first clips was about anti-Asian racism, and it was something that we really wanted to make visible, and like for the Yabon Award ceremony, we decided to pick every kind of racism that we could hear in the media, and I've never thought about just singling out one kind of racism. And the fact that I first was involved in feminist group made me very quickly aware of the way Muslim women who were visibly Muslim were targeted and excluded from the feminist movement as it was mainstream at that time. And I remember, seeing like Muslim women being physically kicked out of protests, of marches, because of the hijabs. So yes, it was obvious to me that we needed to think about racism. I mean, Ziad Bena and Bouna Traoré, who were chased by the police and died trying to hide themselves in a power station. They were from Malian background and Tunisian background, so they died all together, and they were friends. There was actually a third teenager who was from Turkish background. So it was very obvious from the very beginning to me that police brutality didn't like really discriminate who would be a victim or not.
Right. So, so if I understand you correctly, and I didn't know that, this is why this format is interesting, because I would say the same. That is to say, I became conscious of all these things we call race, sometimes too quickly, but with the law, right? That is to say, the 2004 law, the banning of the veil, basically, where I also was completely shocked by what I'd heard in actually the high school I was in and so on. But so this is interesting. So you would say that this law has been a central moment in your prise de conscience, so to speak, right?
Yes, I think that there was the context, like the rise of Sarkozy, like him being appointed Minister of Interior in 2002, and starting to have that public discourse on national identity. So it wasn't so explicit in the early 2000s. But he had a very tough discourse on the banlieue, on the fact that young men shouldn't gather together, in front of the buildings of the housing projects. So that shocked me, and the fact that yes, in 2004, not only there was all the conversations around the law, but also the fact that there were no Muslim women visible in the debate. So there was a debate every single day about the hijab, but there was never one of them, one of the women or girls who would be affected by the law, who could have a chance just to speak for themselves. So it's, but it was more the context of the rise of Sarkozy that really opened my eyes about the fact that yes, politicians were using race as a tool to succeed, actually.
There is a common idea in France, I suppose elsewhere too, but I think it's actually waning. But at the time we're talking about, it was very prominent among, anti-racist circles and people who I'm sure who are common friends and so on. Won't give names and so on, but there was this idea that, in the end, Islamophobia is just anti-Arab racism, and I never fully agreed. And partly what you're telling me and telling us is that somehow you felt that this was also targeting not just the Arab communities of France, right? So how does because Islamophobia is seen most of the time as anti-Arab racism or veiled anti-Arab racism, but basically, do you think of Islamophobia in a country like France as something that is actually systemic to the extent that it precisely is able to target different communities, right?
I think so. I think it's like mostly a way to express an acceptable form of racism, like using the French universalism, the French laïcité. But for example, if you pick the example of the football team, most of them are blacks, but they are still seen as Muslims. So it's like I think it targets people who are seen as being from the banlieue. Like but still it affects. I think it mostly affects people who are seen as Arabs, even if they are not actually Muslims, and groups of blacks and Arabs. When they are public, for example, I'd say like just we were speaking about Aya Nakamura, that French singer who is who was offered to sing for at the opening of the Olympic ceremony in Paris, and that really struck a controversy that really lasted way too long. And she's black. She was born in Mali, but she grew up in France, and her family is probably Muslim. But I've never heard anyone speaking about her as being someone I don't think that she faces Islamophobia in that way. It's like it's just anti-blackness and classism also because she's from the suburbs. So it really depends. It really depends on who you are with and of the context.
So I wonder what you would think about the following analysis. That is to say, I would tend to think that Islamophobia, for reasons we'll talk more about, but you already mentioned, is, as you said, something that can be easily deployed in the public sphere because it's acceptable, because people will very easily say, no, I'm not. It's not racist because I'm not criticizing a race but a religion. Mm-hmm. And of course, there is the norm of secularism that I'm sure we'll talk more about. But even though it doesn't target people in the same way, would you say that precisely because of this institutional moral legitimacy it has in the public sphere, it also nurtures Black racism in very specific ways? It's very specific to France, by which this is what I mean. That is to say, you think that it nurtures in the sense that it also just helps racism to be deployed in any case, right? So it targets Arabs, probably more so, but in the meantime, of course, it has consequences for other communities, right?
Yeah, for example, the theory of the Great Replacement, that is a racist theory, which supposes that like there is a group, like a wave of people coming from Africa to purposely replace the original European population. It's fueled with Islamophobia because the idea is that they want to take over and to install, the Sharia and all the Muslims' customs, and like it doesn't really make a difference between Blacks and Arabs, and even people who, like many of the migrants, for example, who come through the Mediterranean, come, for example, from Eritrea, from countries in which that are not overwhelmingly Muslim, but still they are seen as being part of that replacement and also that cultural replacement involving Islam. So of course, Islamophobia is makes that theory stronger because everything is seen as being part of that conspiracy theory, and all people coming from the African continent as are part of that supposed threat.
Yeah. See what you mean. That's a very good example. I hadn't think about that. Yes, absolutely. And what about this relationship to secularism? I mean, we talked about it a bit, before, in the sense that. So you wrote with someone who's a very prominent expert on laïcité or secularism, whom I know as well. But you actually wrote a book with him called Jean Bobéro, and yeah, I would like us to talk more about something that also might sound very French to people here, but there's some sort of the double edge of secularism, so to speak, or double secularism even. That is to say, on the one hand, it's impossible, not to notice, and this would be, the Anglophones are very good at noticing this because it's so obvious. That is to say, the very exclusionary and therefore racist, in many ways, dimensions of this claim of being secular, right? To the point where I would tend to say that a certain norm of secularism is part of whiteness in France. But in the meantime, you emphasize as an actor, right, not just as a critique or as an intellectual or as an academic, the necessity to claim secularism against precisely this racist secularism, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you see this? How does it structure also how you intervene in the public space?
Yes, it's because I was telling earlier about that 2004 law that banned religious signs in school, but that was really targeting headscarves. It was interesting because even if it was claiming the principle of laïcité, it just created an exception because originally the principle of laïcité is supposed to concern the state. Like the state is supposed to be neutral and to protect any religious expression. But if you use a public service, you don't have to be neutral. You can be whoever you are. And so that law was no longer adequation with the principle of laïcité, because it was just expanding it to the public, to the children teenagers who would go to school and who would be required to be neutral. So in that sense, just re-explaining what the principle of laïcité was, and showing that law had nothing to do with the principle, was to me a way that to prove that it was just a claim that wasn't really backed by the 1905 law. So that's and like it's been like from that law in 2004, many other bills, decrees, and decisions have been made to exclude more and more Muslim girls, Muslim women from many different spaces, like from schools, from the streets, from the Olympics, for example, that will take place, and so using or reminding what the principle of laïcité, secularism, is supposed to be, as opposed to what's happening now, is also a way to show that it's just racism and Islamophobia that is covered by a version of the laïcité that no longer has to do with what it was supposed to do to be at the beginning.
Does it work? That's my question. Or do you
to say that?
Yes.
It doesn't work because we're not many to say that in the public sphere. Like it's accepted now as something normal. Like, for example, just recently in September, the government decided to ban the abayas in high school. So the abayas are like Middle Eastern dresses with long sleeves, but in reality, there is no way to tell an abaya apart from a dress. Like, it's impossible to say if someone has bought that abaya in Dubai or in H&M. So it's but what was interesting is that abaya were banned in a decree, but the word abaya is not in the dictionary. So it's like there is no actual definition in French of that word. And no one knows what an abaya is. So the only way to define an abaya is to practice racial profiling. Like, if I wear a dress, it's an abaya, but if someone white wears the same dress, it's not an abaya because it's a dress. So it's and how, like, the way it was accepted by, like, I think it was like 80% of the people in France were in favor of the ban of the abaya, just told me how the propaganda about that new version of laïcité had worked. But at the same time, the younger generation understands now laïcité as a tool of exclusion and of discrimination. So they don't really know what the original definition of the laïcité is, but they think that laïcité is made to exclude Muslim people and Muslim women. So it's interesting also, it was interesting to see how, on TikTok, and how, like, in the polls that were questioning younger generations, how they really rejected that idea of exclusion. But that moment of the abaya ban was so interesting because there was no one who was just, like, in the public sphere, in the media, in the mainstream media, who was just hostile. That, like, very few people were explicitly hostile to that to that provision. It's something that was really well accepted. So and it was interesting to see that it was, we're in the post Me Too era, and having just giving the ability to adults to just check on teenager female bodies, and to to ask them to uncover their themselves should be a feminist issue, and it wasn't really tackled in that way.
Why do you think?
Because Muslim women are not women, I guess. I guess that they're just seen as at the same time as the victims of the Muslim patriarchy, but also as the agents of that same patriarchy. So they are not seen as people who should be protected from, not only from the Muslim patriarchy, but from patriarchy in general. So it allows people just to go in a classroom and say to a teenager, you should just remove you should show your shoulders or your neck, because it's really just to hide them.
Right. I wonder, in this regard, if because I completely understand that you have to say that this is really not what's going on in France since, say, 20 years, not more, 20 years, is not really secular as such, right? This is, I completely understand that this is an important gesture, but sometimes precisely because it ends up being a war of words, or rather people using the same word and fighting against regarding, you know, what's the real definition, and you know, from this regard they won, not us. If in fact emphasizing the fact that we're really talking about religious freedom might not be more efficient, by showing that there is secularism and there is religious freedom. So of course this is a component, but what happens in France is that secularism is increasingly becoming opposed to religious freedom, right?
It's true.
So I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yes, it's true, but it's true. I think that the level of hostility against religions in France in general is so high that it's very difficult to make people understand that you have the right to express yourself religiously in public, because there is also a confusion between atheism and laicity. So people tend to think that hiding your religion is laicity, and not having any religion in public is laicity, and so it's not a context that is really open to accept, because like the idea, especially on the left, is that the left-wing ideologies are supposed to emancipate people from religion, and so it's very difficult for left-wing politicians to accept the idea that you can belong to the left and not not having the need to be to free yourself from religion. So it's also something that needs to be worked on. Yes.
And how did you experience this specifically in your trajectory?
Oh, I remember I was part as a journalist. I worked on a note. It was maybe 10 years ago about laicity with I don't remember. So it was in a kind of left-wing think tank, and we presented the conclusions of our study. And I remember there was she was not a minister, but she became a minister in the socialist government. I think it was in 2011, and the year after she was a minister in the socialist government. And I remember that she said explicitly that she was shocked by the study that we made about laicity, and she said, like, I think that our mission is to free people from religion. I don't think it's okay I don't think that what you say is gonna work, because it's not up to us to support people in expressing their belief, their religious belief.
Right.
Yes.
So what's your connection to the US, and how was it seen out there in France? Why did you came? I mean, you're not here 100% of the time, but you are present in the Anglophone world. So how did this happen, first of all? Just how did it happen?
Oh, the first time I came, I was invited by Maboula Soumaoro, who is a French scholar. She was, at that time, she was teaching in Columbia University, and she organized a day which was named Constructing Black France. So it was even before I started TV and radio. I was still with Les Indivisibles. So it was my first. It's interesting because I was invited by a French person in the US first, but then I was. There is a program that was started by the Department of State in the US, which name is the International Visitor Leadership. So it's supposed to identify young leaders, in their countries when they are in their late 20s or early 30s to kind of it's. The US soft power. So all across the world, every year there are like hundreds of people who are sent to the US for 3 weeks to visit, the country based on the topic that they are interested in. So I was identified by the US Embassy in France, but as many people before me, like Nicolas Sarkozy, Laurent Fabius, many former prime ministers, presidents, high-profile political figures have been part of that program before me. And there has been a shift, I think, in the 2000s because they understood that there were also people, of color who may have a role, in the future of the countries. And it's interesting because when that program opened itself to minorities, it became suspicious. Like people started to just, wonder why the US found that we were so interesting. So, and from that point, newspapers started to publish articles about the US trying to manipulate young people from the suburbs to make them, believing in the US multiculturalism and importing it to France. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm accused of constantly. Of being an agent of the US and trying to dismantle the French Republic. It's a thing I hear all the time, that I'm importing a US lens to France, and that race is not a French thing at all, that we don't have the same history, and that I'm influenced, if not manipulated, by the US to just divide my country and to make it, kind of believing in something that is not it's not French. So it's being here is seen very negatively in France. It's like I'm constantly accused of not really reading France with the French with the French philosophy of being anti-universalism, and that's So that's it started like that. And when I came with the program, I met some scholars who invited me then, and I started to write with the Washington Post because one of the editors just identified me on Twitter, on social media, and she contacted me, and then I met her, and she asked me if I wanted to write for them because they wanted to have something different about Europe and about France, and that's how it started. And here it's very easy to connect with people. So once someone identify you, they can invite you as you did. And I think that Americans are much interested in race in France, and that there are not that many content available on TV and radio that speaks. So it's like when you're interested in race in France, it's easy to come over what I do because it's so difficult to be able to access those platforms and to speak about those topics that at some point it's my work that comes that's really visible.
Mm-hmm. But what there are many things we could say about what you said, but I wanted to focus primarily on two things. The first one is that so we know this narrative. You're importing that and so on. There's no such thing as race in France, but somehow while listening to you, something came to me, which is at least one layer, one dimension of it, which is the fact that it actually completely erases our and your agency in this case, of course, but also the legacy of anti-racism in France, right? As if the only figure or image, and specifically of anti-Black racism, was the US, right? Which, as you know, and I would like to talk about that with you, which is a figure which is ambiguously acceptable also in France, right? As long as it doesn't concern France, of course, right? It's easy to say America is so racist in France. But the thing is, this brings me to different questions. The first one, what is your connection in your relationship to the very long and glorious, to some extent, history of anti-Black racism in this country? And in the meantime, in my view, it's connected to it's the same question. How do you see what you're doing as precisely being something else than just importing right? I mean, it's certainly different than this, right? So I would like to know more about that. How you see this?
I think that it's. The question is interesting because my first documentary in 2013 was about the two legacies of anti-racism in France and in the US. So because 2013 was the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington in the US, and at the same time it was the 30th anniversary of the March for Equality and Against Racism that took place in France, and that was actually inspired by the March on Washington. So like the influence is not new, it's not something new. Like young people in the 80s also looked up to the US and looked up to Martin Luther King and identified themselves, even if they were not black, they were mostly North African. So Tumi Jaija, who initiated the march, really still claims Martin Luther King as one of the figures who inspired him to march when he was 19 in 1983. So in my documentary, I follow a group of young Americans who come for the first time in Paris and who had like all those images in mind of the Eiffel Tower, of the Louvre, and all those places. And then I follow them discovering other parts of France. So they first go to the Élysée Palace, which is the presidential palace, and then they meet Christiane Taubira, who was at the time the Minister of Justice, so the first black woman to hold that position. And then they go to the ceremony to commemorate the abolition of slavery, and they also go to Clichy-sous-Bois, which is the place where Ziad Benna and Bouna Traoré, the teenagers I told you about, were chased and died, being chased by the police. And this, they understand, and they also, of course, meet Tumi Jaija, who is the initiator of the March of '83, and they understand that the image that they have of France is different from what's actually happening. And during their journey, they are also with young French people who realized that they didn't know anything about their own story. So they meet Tumi, and at the same time, French and Americans discover that they had no idea about the fact that before them there were French activists who tried to protest against systemic racism in France. So my work has always been to try to just give visibility to people who were there before me. But it's not seen in the public sphere because it's easier to say that I'm just importing something. My documentary was made in 2013. It was aired on TV, so it's not something that's secret. It's something that you can tell about. But I think that people who hate on me don't want to see like what I really do. You came to the podcast. You were invited in the podcast, and the purpose of our podcast that I created with Grassley is really to make those racial issues French, and to have French people speaking about the legacy of the French colonialism and the French slavery. So it has always been my work to make sure that we speak about France. But at the same time, it's interesting how people, would accuse many of us of importing something that is American. But at the same time, when it's, the public institutions in France has the opportunity to honor, a figure, an anti-racist figure in the public space, they would, for example, in a train station in Paris, they would pick Rosa Parks rather than anyone French. Why I adore, of course, Rosa Parks, but we do have French black women who were against racism. There is a park that is named after Martin Luther King. In Paris, there are high schools that are named after Nelson Mandela. So it's interesting how they accuse us of not acknowledging France, but at the same time they won't name places after Paulette Nardal or other black or Arab or Asian figures who were against French colonialism.
Yes. One last question: what is it, before we open it to the public? What is your connection to precisely this legacy, also from a theoretical point of view? I'm thinking about Césaire, but also Fanon, But also, I was wondering what your connection to the legacy of the Algerian Revolution was as well, right? Because it's quite clear that from an institutional political point of view, many things come from this war, if only because the Fifth Republic was created because of this war. So there is this institutional dimension which is important beyond the country itself. But so, it's two questions in one. But so how do you situate yourself, with regards to this literary political legacy, which, the names I quoted were mostly, Caribbean, but also on the other hand, and more broadly to, the anti-colonial revolutionary traditions that are also very, present in France, right?
We just so our podcast Kiftaras is out every 2 weeks, and the next one will be about Jean-Marie Le Pen and the torture in Algeria. So it's something that we try to bring to the public, because it tends to be erased, the fact that the National Rally, which was the National Front, was founded by someone who took part to the war, against people who were trying to emancipate themselves from French colonialism. If it's about regarding feminism and Islamophobia, of course, I constantly remind the fact that there were unveiling ceremonies in Algeria in the 50s. It's something that I try to connect the fact that trying to unveil Muslim women today has to do with what was going on during the Algerian Revolution, and the idea of civilizing people who were seen as not assimilating in the French identity. And what was your question again?
First one was about Fanon and Césaire.
Yes. So it's it's part of the people that I've quoted, part of the people that we really claim as the people that should have schools, streets,
right.
Institutions named after them. So there is now a train station a metro station named Aimé Césaire. But I think I signed a petition for Fanon to be commemorated in Bordeaux. I don't remember, but Alain Juppé, the mayor, was against that. So it's still something that whenever there is something, I'm part of.
So you're bringing something I can't really resist. I think Aimé Césaire is more acceptable than Frantz Fanon.
Of course, yeah.
I have a little answer, but I think. But why do you think?
I think that there is also a way, people like to romanticize poetry. So he was a poet. And I think that I don't know. Frantz Fanon is always seen, is not that known in France.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that someone told me in 2011 it was the 50th anniversary of his death, and someone was trying to have the public service of the radio just having something to commemorate his death, and the head of the radio said that he was a terrorist. Mm-hmm. So I think that has to do with and Alain Juppé, the mayor of Bordeaux, had the same kind of rhetoric to justify the fact that he wouldn't honor him in his city.
Revolution, Algeria. So if you put the two together, it's over.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Ainsley had a question, and Ainsley first. Many questions.
Just thinking about this history of, the claim that folks are bringing American lens to France, which I find maddening, right? But you sort of talking about the history, right, of Black activists in France. What about negritude? So how does negritude show up in sort of French conversations or French culture as sort of this movement, that is thematizing race, that is trying to sort of talk about racialization as it is connected to colonialism and the reclamation of African identity, right? How do they reckon with that sort of history?
I think that they managed to erase the history. I was just mentioning something that was closer in time, which is the march in 1983. Like no one, like most of people don't know about that march, and it was only 40 years ago, and people, the protagonists of the march are still there. And there is kind of, organized amnesia that erases all the time whatever has happened in order to make sure that we cannot, trace our history back to something that is rooted in the French context. So, of course, the march, but also the social struggles of the workers in the 70s, in the 60s, of like Algerian or North African or even African workers. It's something that is already, that is never told and that people don't know about. So we always have to and even the younger generations, I remember like last year, for example, when Naël Merzouk, the teenager, it's the teenager who was killed in his car by a cop. It was captured by a video. He was 17, and it sparked outrage all across the suburbs. There were, uprisings, lots of, facilities destroyed because, young people were very angry. And I don't know, like it was just 40 years after the march, and I think that those young people couldn't connect their experience with what had happened in the 80s. And I think that's also part of the oppression, to make sure that you don't have a knowledge of your history and you cannot really connect with your elders because you don't know. So I think it's the same with the négritude and those literary movements.
Nadia, another question.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm interested in what I think is a quite complex relationship between feminisms based in France and then anti-colonial, anti-racist discourse. So on the one hand, what I see in France is this kind of still a very white, secular French feminists who are very much contributing to racist and Islamophobic discourse and are so I was based in London for a while, and it was always sort of shocking to see, the difference actually. On the other hand, though, you have people, I think her name is Françoise Verge. I actually got into an argument with her at a conference in Berlin because I felt she was throwing feminism under the bus and basically portraying feminism as a kind of white Western phenomena. And this was in the context of feminism in the Middle East and North Africa, where you have feminist activists struggling for their rights daily, and they certainly didn't need a Western feminist to tell them. And so I'm just sort of wondering, clearly she was reacting to those very white, liberal, secular feminists. But what is the scene, and how do you position yourself between these complex politics?
I think that Françoise Vergès is, because the title of her book is Decolonial Feminism, so it's more about decolonizing feminism and trying to make sure that it's centered on the voices of the most marginalized women, and that's what I'm trying to do, just to make sure that feminism is not only voicing concerns of the most privileged women, but that it centers itself on women who are Muslim, who are trans, who are disabled, and that they are taken into account. For example, we're having that conversation now about that there is a strong revival of the Me Too movement in France now in the cinema, because actor Gérard Depardieu has been accused by, I think, 13 women of abuse. And also actress Judith Godrèche is now just revisiting what she experienced as a teenager, being groomed and raped by a very famous filmmaker, so it's a very important moment. But there are also in that moment we don't see that many women of color. For example, there is an actress, Annabelle Bousson-Diagne, who said that she was one of the very first French actresses to tell about being sexually abused in the French cinema, and she's always forgotten, she's always erased. So like just trying to yeah, I think it's more about like maybe make sure that it's not always about the same kind of women who have a voice, who have attention, and who don't really who kind of erase the women who are not visible. Like even, for example, there have been a very important social movement of women who were cleaners in hotels, and it lasted 200 days, I think 320 days. And those women said that not only they were underpaid and they were working in a way that was really not aligned with human rights, but they also faced sexual abuse. And I'm really surprised not to see feminist movements supporting them on that, because it was in, it was in maybe 2018, 2019. So I haven't seen their struggle being included in the mainstream feminist struggle, even if they were victorious, which doesn't happen that much. And one of them was even elected to be an MP at the National Assembly. So it's more about that, I think.
There's a question here and here. I'll go first, maybe. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I guess I just want you to kind of talk a little bit more about like colonialism and the history of colonialism and how it's denied in Europe, because anti-Black racism is deeply rooted in just like colonial history that most of the European countries deny. And then like racism becomes a problem that is in the US, who have ties to the transatlantic slave trade. But we don't, not we, but Europeans don't really talk enough about how they profited from that entire Atlantic Triangle. And then I wanted to also kind of bring up Black Muslims. So in the case of France, I guess Senegal would be a good example as one of the former colonies. I do my research in Italy. Somalia is a kind of another example for that. But there's something there that is where kind of Islamophobia and anti-Black racism kind of comes together. And for me, at the very least, colonialism is kind of at the very root of that. So I guess if you can elaborate on that a little bit, that'd be great.
Yes, it's true that for European, I think it's easy to deny colonialism and slavery because most of it didn't happen on the European soil. So it's easy to act as if you didn't know, you didn't see, and nothing happens. And it's especially interesting in France because France is the only country to be located on 4 continents and to have departments in so many different places, like in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific, and everybody acts as if it was normal, as if it was just something that randomly happened for no reason. So it's and we don't really have that conversation about how those territories, which are now French departments, are still facing structural discrimination. Some of them have been poisoned. Some of them are being bombed by nuclear tests, and it's not a conversation at all. Even in the Green Party, for example, which should really show how those territories have been the tests, the places where so many different experiments have started. So it's and colonialism is still part of even our international relationship. What's going on in West Africa, for example, all those countries that are turning back to France, lately, like Senegal, but Niger, Burkina, Mali. We act as if it wasn't an issue, and as if it, when we speak about immigration, it's always a one-sided conversation, and we don't speak about the fact that so many French and European companies are there, they're making money from being settled in those countries, and it's not only it's extracting resources, but also having how can I say that, phone companies, internet companies, like Orange, Free, they are there. And if you go to Morocco, to Senegal, to Ivory Coast, you will find a Carrefour, Orange, Free, the internet provider. And nobody seems to, be willing to have the conversation about how we do benefit. We still benefit from exploiting the very resources of African countries, and how how does the fact that having so many departments all over the place makes France the second comment tu dis domaine maritime, la deuxième surface maritime au monde. Je crois que c'est le décalage horaire là, c'est fini.
Domaine maritime.
La France c'est le deuxième pour ceux qui parlent.
Right.
C'est le deuxième.
I don't know how you would translate that.
Je sais pas.
Sea domaine.
Oui, c'est ça. C'est la deuxième plus grande surface maritime en fait, au monde.
Got it.
In maritime zone, is it?
Yeah.
Yes, like the second one, and like when you think about like the size of France and how it's possible that they have so many, spaces in the sea, of course, it's still colonialism.
How should we push for a conversation? Like, I guess that's kind of the problem. Like, official, like, what is your suggestion to young, people, young scholars, young activists?
I think to document that and to make those populations visible. Like I've just seen, I don't know if you've seen that this week. Marine Le Pen went to Mayotte. Have you seen those images? Mm-hmm. That's insane. Like it's and she does her best scores there. It's like almost fully, like totally black island, and I think it's 97% Muslim. And seeing her like just being so welcome in a territory that is because of xenophobia against people from the Comoros, it's shocking.
There is a question here and then she there.
I can ask a question in French or in English. It's up to you. Do you prefer in French?
Yes,
I know we're just. Sorry.
Whatever you prefer.
So I just have one question. Actually, I have two questions. One of what you were saying about the U.S. Embassy program, and the fact that people then see you as very suspicious. Do you think that in a way it allows France to strip you from your Frenchness? Because then they see you as a double foreign agent, when in fact France really prides itself that during the segregation and the Jim Crow era, they were so welcoming of Miles Davis. They were like, we welcome him in those non-segregated audiences, or James Baldwin, for example, who ended up who moved to Paris and then later lived in Var and died there. And so, do you think that there's a kind of like, is it to like strip you from Frenchness? And one quick question. In your podcast, the one thing that really, really comes back is the fact that you have so much humor and you use humor all the time. Do you see laughter as a kind of like resistance? Because like your podcast has like very serious issues, but they always end up like they're always filled with laughter, and that's the thing that I really noticed from your podcast. So yeah, those are two questions. Thank you.
Maybe we'll take several questions so that.
Okay.
Yeah, there was another one.
So I'm based at Columbia, and I've been spending time on the encampment since last Wednesday, and I've been witnessing the students, faculty coming together, Jews, Muslims, atheists, Black Lives groups, feminist groups. Everyone's there together using humor, chanting, singing, eating together, and then meeting with the students out of that zone, which is being perceived by the outside world as something very different going on in that zone, including the administration of Columbia. But then talking to students outside the encampment, saying that my Indonesian students who I had to sit down and put a formal complaint because they thought they were discriminated against because of wearing the hijab. They feel very intimidated by, the police presence is overwhelming on campus. And they feel most threatened by the police and how the police are looking at them until they swipe their Columbia's ID and get into campus, and they feel safe again, away from the police. So I'm just trying to think, I'm just thinking about the work that you do, which is like the encampment of bringing everyone together, giving them a voice, connecting against these wider forces which don't want to hear what's being said and the work that they're trying to do. So I don't know what my question is, but I'm just feeling like the work that we're trying to do has so many forces against us, and I was really fascinated by the French context of, we all have our different contexts that we're working within, but the strength that we have collectively and transnationally, I think it's just so difficult for so many forces to take, because they feel like it's just too much of a threat for various reasons. So I don't know really what my question is, but it's just to say that I think we have a lot of forces against us what we're trying to do, but we have to make it work.
Okay, so about thank you so much. Thank you. About the podcast, I think that I created the podcast with Grassley, who is a friend of mine, and I think that being friends is also part of the identity of the podcast. We really wanted to speak about race in the same way as we had those conversations in our lives, and we feel like the media really deprived us from being able to speak about those issues in our own terms. So kind of making fun of racists, but also, just being ourselves is, of course, I think it's a way to resist, and that was also the purpose of what I did with Les Indivisibles, with the ceremony, which was so funny, because when you expose people who say crazy things, and suddenly like there is a public, and you watch the clip and you understand how racist they are. It's just returning the stigma and taking power over them, and the podcast is the same. And it's also because whenever you have a public discussion about race, it's always very tense, and that's the thing that we didn't want to do. And your first question was about I don't remember, I'm sorry. It was
about people seeing you.
Yes. I think that when you're not white, you have to prove, in France, you have to prove all the time that you are loyal to your country. So whatever you do, when you critique France, when you do something that is, you're suddenly seen and suspected of betraying your country. So of course it's part of using the US to say that I'm not loyal to France is one of the tools that is usually used against people who don't, say in every sentence, I'm here thanks to the French Republic and the Enlightenment theory. And it's the thing that the requestment to be able to speak publicly as a minority is just to be so grateful, so thankful to the Republic, and then you're allowed to say something. But if you watch, for example, the speeches of ministers when they are appointed, and especially ministers of color, it's funny to see how they always speak about how school was so helpful for them and how they're grateful to the public school, to the French Republic, because they, without the Republic they wouldn't make it there. And it's something that I always ask if I love France. Do you like France? Do you love France? And it's not a person I don't know.
But it is a person for the state. That's the problem. So what do you answer then?
I said that, what do you mean by France? Is it people? Is it the idea? Is it? And I said that I don't want to answer, and that you can interpret the way I critique France both ways. You can critique something that you want to be better, and you don't have to like France. It's not like a legal requirement. So it's legal to not to like France.
The boundaries of the law are very blurred today in France, but elsewhere too. So maybe there is a last question. I mean, not just the last. Yes, that's true.
Yeah, I felt it was more like a comment. I don't know if you expected an answer. But
thanks for sharing it. I think there is a question in the back. So Luvuyo has a question.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious about your thoughts or reading of the recent anti-colonial, anti-imperialist resistance wave in West Africa. And I'm thinking with Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. And I'm being cautious because in some cases these are military coups, and in other instances a change in governance. So I just, I was really curious, as someone who's sort of like looking eagerly, what your thoughts are.
It's interesting. It's very interesting, and I don't know what will come out of there because as you said, it's very different. Like Senegal had an election, in Niger and Mali it was different, but it really echoes a sentiment in the African youth of just tiredness, like against France, like and I think that Macron has been part of. Like the way his attitude has been also really fueled anger. Like his very first visits to Africa, the fact that when he, the first international travel that he had when he was elected in May 2017 after Germany, like the first international travel out of Europe was in Mali in 2017, and he didn't even bother to go to Bamako. He went to the north to visit the troops and asked the president to travel and to see him there. So I think that, multiplying those kind of attitudes really angered people. And, there have been some, different instances when he spoke to presidents in a certain way that was really seen as offensive locally. And yes, I think that we need maybe to watch and to see what will happen, and if everything will go in the same direction.
Amir, and then Tangam.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question to this. I'm wondering how it was received by French youth in particular. And my follow-up question that I thought of before this is, how is the language of Blackness in particular cohering amongst the youth in different sects in France? Like, what's the reception been? I've been for example, in Djibouti, critiquing colonialism or the post-colonial state has, for me, I've noticed, come through the lens or language of Blackness. I would even say in Egypt as well. So I'm just wondering, how is Blackness as a language, a lens, a way of viewing anti-Black racism cohering amongst the youth, perhaps if they're organizers or even on social media, how it's being received, kind of also hopping off this question of how did the recent movements, we could say, in West Africa be received as well?
I don't really know how it was received, like how all those movements were received in the youth. What I can tell about is about Senegal, because my family comes partly from Senegal, and the Senegalese diaspora was very active in trying just to challenge Macky Sall and the threats to democracy, and many of the French dual citizenship voted. There was a line that was very long in the electoral offices when the elections took place in March. So among the African diaspora, not only the youth, it was very an important issue. I can't tell about Niger or Mali. And I'm not sure. Can you maybe explain more your second question about how about the language of Blackness?
Yes. So I feel like everywhere that I've gone, there's this almost shared language of anti-Black racism vis-a-vis Blackness. So, and I'm just wondering, in France, amongst the youth, I've met with youth in Djibouti and even in Jordan and Egypt. There's this language of anti-Black racism that seems to come up. And it's bizarre because we all share very similar terms. There's a similar ground that can be found. And I'm wondering if what that ground looks like in France, and how people are engaging with it, be it in the academy or if it's just regular lay people, if you want to call it that. So I'm just wondering how it's cohering amongst these groups? Because it seems, right, even in the terms of like, I think colorism comes up quite often as like a very,
yes.
right, it's like desire, marriage, sex, these things kind of come up with talks of anti-Black racism, Blackness generally. So I'm wondering if it's cohering in certain ways.
I'd say that language is very visible on social media, like on social media content, on productions that are authored by, influencers or young journalists. But I don't know if, on an everyday basis, if you speak about colorism to just an average Black person, if it really echoes with something. I'm not sure about that, but I can tell that among the youth, young people who are really interested in race, who are very engaged on social media, on maybe some kind of groups, that language is the same language that is used that we can hear here, yes, but I don't know more. I haven't really looked closer.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting conversation. So one cannot not notice the incredible range of gestures and sort of, let's say, the range of platforms that you use for your work. So you are a very active social media person. You have a podcast. You're writing books. You make films, etc. So there are many different kinds of languages that you're using. And so I'm wondering whether you could just tell us something about your sense of how these different modes or media work, but also in terms of temporalities, because they're different temporalities in a sense. And I'm asking this question partly because when it comes to these topics and when it comes to this moment, it's so hard to actually have a conversation sometimes because of the sheer tensions, the sheer kind of polarizations, the kind of the mass reactions to certain things. So one sometimes feels like the mode of writing or filmmaking or something might allow for a different kind of thing to be said. So I'm wondering whether you have thoughts on how these different moves are working in terms of what you've been striving to do. And maybe one other little part would be, can you tell us something about about the status of efforts to change things at a national education level? Are we really far away from that, or is there actually a move towards reforming curriculum to have more to have a different kind of education when it comes to anti-colonial, anti-racist legacies that are French?
I know that some changes regarding the curriculum have been included in the laws, in some laws, especially in the law that was voted 23 years ago. To make the Atlantic slave trade a crime against humanity. I don't know how much the changes have been significant, but they are supposed to have been included. But I don't really know. I don't really know how much it's been visible. Like those stories have been visible in the public education, and that's still I don't know. I'm not sure, but I don't think that the Minister of Education that we've had over the last years were really very open to because the last one of the most prominent education minister that we've had under Macron started a kind of think tank against wokeism. So that doesn't really look like something that would include much anti-colonialist history. And your question was so I kind of I happened to worked on different platforms and to produce different contents because of the doors that were closed at some point. It's to me just a way to navigate from a place where I can't work to a place where I can, because if I'm here, it's also because it's very difficult in France. I write for 2 international medias and I don't write for any French media. I've never written for Le Monde or Libération, so it's also one of the reasons why I try to navigate between creating documentaries, because making documentaries is also a way to have a 1 hour, 1 hour and a half content that is not challenged, is not like going on a debate and you have all those very agitated people interrupting you all the time. So it's
to say the least. Agitated, I like it.
So it's a very different exercise. So just try to just use the platforms depending on what's more efficient. When there is a controversy, I'm like, okay, I'm going to that news channel to make my point, and use also my social media to share what I say, because I have a following on social media that is very different to the people who watch TV, because they are younger and they are more, progressive, I have to say. So it's to me it's a balance. When something doesn't work, I try to, when the door is closed, I try to open the window, and it's more because I've been challenged so much that I've had to be creative. That it was not my will at the first place, but I had to learn to make different things, because it's still difficult today in France to do what I do.
It reminds me of something. The MTA, the Mouvement des Travailleurs Arabes, right? So the movement of Arab workers, which was in the 70s, mid-70s. And actually there is something that they used to say was the necessity of constructing cultural autonomy, not just political autonomy, cultural autonomy. And this is an idea that is very much rooted in the histories of anti-racist activism in France, which is also connected to anti-colonialism globally. And that doesn't need, the reference back to the United States to make this claim. And I think, you also represent that. I think this is a logic of cultural autonomy in many ways, right? To the extent that, it's creating one's own means of production, and sounded very Marxist, didn't it? Means of voicing oneself. So
yes, and maybe I can add something also. I've started a training program to, train young journalists and activists to public speaking. To make sure, because you know that when you are public, you can face a controversy that just makes you disappear. So to me, it's important now to make sure that I can, just push some younger people to be in the place I have been before, because you have had so many people who were there before me that I don't know about because they disappeared too quickly, and they weren't really able to tell about their experience, to share their experience, and just to open their platforms to others. So to me, now the challenge is to make sure that I'm not the only one, and that other people will be on those in those places.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rokhaya.
Thank you.